Good morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Charlie State and Naga Munchetti.
Our headlines today. Fears that there could be a delay in lifting lockdown in England as cases of the Indian variant double in a week.
There are calls for 40 specialist surgical hubs to be set up to tackle a colossal backlog of non-urgent operations.
Good morning. Making sure that loyalty pays. Should insurance firms be banned from raising prices for existing customers whilst luring new ones with cheaper deals? The regulator will decide this morning, so I'll find out what could change and what it could mean for your premiums.
Mark Ormrod lost his arm and both legs when he was injured in Afghanistan. This morning we'll be with him as he attempts to complete an epic swim for charity.
Good morning. Another great Friends reunion could be on the cards. Tottenham reached out to their former manager Mauricio Pochettino about returning as boss, and he did say once it would be his dream to come back.
Good morning. A slightly cloudier day today with some rain around, particularly towards the west, but things turn increasingly warm and sunny through the bank holiday weekend. I'll have all your details here on Breakfast.
Good morning. It's Friday the 28th of May. Up to three-quarters of new COVID cases could be linked to the Indian variant. This according to the Health Secretary Matt Hancock.
There are concerns the increase in infections could delay plans to lift all restrictions in England on June the 21st. Our correspondent James Reynolds has the latest.
In Bolton, the race between the vaccine and the variant is fought at the pace of an average British queue. In recent weeks, up to several thousand people a day have waited patiently for their turn to be jabbed. In this town, the Indian variant is hitting those who haven't been vaccinated. The number of cases of the Indian variant in England has more than doubled since last week, rising to almost 7,000. According to the Health Secretary, up to three-quarters of new UK COVID cases could be linked to the variant. The worst affected areas in England continue to be Bolton, Bedford and Blackburn with Darwin. 7 other areas in England each have more than 100 confirmed cases of the variant.
The critical thing to watch is the link from the number of cases to how many people end up in hospital. The increase in cases remains focused in hotspots, and we're doing all we can to tackle this variant wherever it flares up.
The Prime Minister said we may need to wait for the lifting of all COVID restrictions. But he added that there was nothing currently in the data from England to suggest that the easing couldn't go ahead as planned. The next 2 weeks, then, may be crucial. A decision is expected in mid-June. James Reynolds, BBC News.
Matt Hancock is also under growing pressure over the deaths of thousands of care home residents.
Prime Minister's former advisor Dominic Cummings accused him of lying early on in the pandemic about care home residents being tested for coronavirus after leaving hospital. But Mr Hancock says the allegations are unsubstantiated and untrue.
Our political correspondent Damien Grammaticus has more detail.
The Health Secretary has been under real pressure now for 2 days, ever since Dominic Cummings' evidence to Parliament on Wednesday, when he accused the Health Secretary of lying on multiple occasions, particularly about that subject of care homes and the claim, he said, that Matt Hancock had made that people being discharged from hospital would all be tested for COVID before returning to care homes. Matt Hancock has said that the claims that he lied were unsubstantiated and untrue. But what we had last night on the Question Time programme on BBC was Nadra Ahmed, the head of the chair of the National Care Association. She said that the claim Mr Hancock had made last year that a protective ring had been placed around care homes was not true. She said absolute rubbish. If there had been a protective ring, she said, well, then there would have been a plan in place to protect those vulnerable people. Mr Hancock was questioned about this, and what he said to journalists yesterday was that there had been a testing programme was being built. He said he admitted the capacity didn't exist at the start of the pandemic to test everyone because it took time to put in place, and he said he worked hard to do that. But what all of this, I think, shows is the fallout from Dominic Cummings' evidence heaping pressure on Matt Hancock.
Damien Grammaticus there.
Surgeons are calling for specialist hubs to be set up in England to help tackle what they call the colossal backlog of non-urgent operations that have been postponed because of the pandemic.
In March, around 5 million patients were waiting for surgery. That's the highest number since records began. The government says it is working to accelerate the recovery of services. Our health correspondent Laura Foster has more.
When the pandemic began, hospital trusts had to cancel non-urgent surgeries, such as hip and knee replacements, so there were enough staff and resources to look after patients with Covid-19. But since then, waiting times and lists have only grown. 14 months on from the first lockdown, latest figures show almost 5 million people are on the waiting list. More than 400,000 of them have been waiting for more than a year.
Well, these are the worst waiting time figures ever recorded. And we all understand that stuff had to be put on hold whilst there was the pandemic. But now the pandemic is beginning to recede. We need a serious approach to getting into this backlog.
The college says the answer is to spend £1 billion a year over the next 5 years and to carry out operations not at local hospitals but at dedicated hubs. That way, these hubs would still function even if there was another wave of COVID or indeed another pandemic. The college argues people are willing to travel further if it means surgeries happen sooner. Laura Foster, BBC News.
Residents in Glasgow are expected to find out later whether the city will remain in level 3 of Scotland's COVID-19 restrictions. The city has been under strict measures for 270 days, while the rest of Scotland has seen restrictions ease in recent weeks. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said there are reasons to be optimistic about the situation.
Manchester United Football Club says it's disgusted by the abuse that some of its players have received online following their loss in the Europa League final earlier this week.
One player, Marcus Rashford, said he'd been sent at least 70 racial slurs. Let's go to our reporter Phil McCann, who's outside Old Trafford for us this morning. Phil, so this is now part of a police investigation. What do we know so far?
Well, Greater Manchester Police, Charlie, have said that they are investigating a number of racially aggravated slurs on social media directed towards numerous Manchester United players. Now, of course, this is, as you mentioned, after the loss in the Europa League final on Wednesday night. And by midnight on Wednesday, Marcus Rashford had tweeted that he had received at least 70 slurs by that point, just a few hours later, on social media. And yesterday he tweeted, "I'm built for criticism of my performance, but can't accept some of the racist taunts that have been directed towards him." Now, the club here has said that it has zero tolerance to any form of racism. The police are now going through these posts to see if any of them or some of them might constitute a hate crime. And they've also said that those people who've been posting them could face long-term implications to their personal and professional lives. And that maybe after Marcus Rashford yesterday said one of the things that disgusted him the most was that some of these comments seemed to come from somebody who was a teacher. Their profile on Twitter made clear that they were a teacher. Now, the Department for Education says that it is looking into that. And Facebook, which also owns Instagram, has said that it's removed a number of posts, but for years now, of course, it's come under mounting pressure to do more about abuse online. And this club has also added to that pressure this morning.
Phil, separately, I understand Marcus Rashford has been speaking to former US President Barack Obama. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, just in case you thought that Marcus Rashford couldn't get any more influential, here he is now talking to Barack Obama. This was a Zoom meeting ahead of a new book that Barack Obama is bringing out. It was moderated by June Sarpong. And a lot of this Zoom meeting involved the former president heaping praise on Marcus Rashford, who is, of course, just 23 years old.
Marcus, I think, is way ahead of where I was at 23. I was still trying to figure it out.
For me, being in sports, I just knew that my life could change very, very quickly. And if I wasn't mature enough or, at a certain level in my own head, then it makes stuff like fame and bits like that even more difficult.
When you look at the history of big social movements and big social change, it's usually young people who initiate this.
If you give someone a helping hand at a young age, they'll go on to do things that, even they didn't think or believe that was achievable to accomplish.
So that was just a short clip there from a much longer Zoom meeting. They also talked about the similarities that they have between them, the fact that they were both brought up by single mums, for example, the fact they've both been involved in community work. But you heard at the beginning there Barack Obama saying that Marcus Rashford is way ahead of where he was at that age. That, of course, from a former US president.
Phil, thank you very much.
Measuring the amount of squashed bugs, flies on your car after a journey may be able to help scientists better understand insect populations in the UK.
So a new app is asking the public to gather the information to identify where certain species are thriving and where others are in decline. Here's our Chief Environment Correspondent, Justin Rolat.
Insectageddon is how the global decline in insect populations has been described by some scientists. One case study in Germany suggested there'd been a 75% decrease in numbers over 27 years. Take the humble housefly. You may not like them, but like many insects, they're one of the foundations of the whole food chain. If we lose them, we'll lose lots of other species too. But there's actually very little data for many insect groups and species, even here in the UK, which is where this new app comes in. The hope is that in the hands of a small army of citizen scientists, it'll generate more accurate figures for insect populations. It's simple to use. You clean your number plate before you go on a journey. Then, when you arrive at your destination, you use the app to photograph the bugs squashed on a section of it using a splatometer grid you get when you download the app. The results? They become part of the nationwide survey. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.